Welcome everyone to this joint webinar of the ISOC India Chennai chapter and the ISOC UK England chapter of the Internet Society. It's the first time we do a joint webinar like this, but Shiva and I have worked on for many years in running our societies and to do some joint meetings and work with each other. And so I wanted to thank him for first producing much of the material that you're going to see today, but at the same time also to suggest this joint webinar. And I hope that it will be the first in a series of webinars that we'll be able to do across chapters. My name is Olivier Crepin-Leblanc. I'm the chair of the English chapter. Shiva is online on his side. He doesn't have his video on. Shiva, did you want to say a few words as well?
No, Olivier, please go ahead. Go ahead with the meeting. Towards the end of the meeting, I'll just make a short intervention. That's about it.
Okay, that sounds good. So then let's start immediately. In today's webinar, I'm going to share screens. And here we go. That should work. And today, if we start with present. Today's webinar is on core Internet values, changes happening on the way the Internet works, the desirable and undesirable changes. Can you all see this? Is this all working? Yeah, I can see a thumbs up from Jolie. Okay, thanks for that. So I'm obviously sharing my screen now on this. This is a Prezi presentation. And so today we'll have first the quick introduction to the Internet, and I'm hoping to go through this in about 10 to 15 minutes, so that'll go really quick. Then we'll have Tatiana Tropina, who joins us from the Max Planck Institute and is also with the ICANN non-commercial stakeholder group, non-commercial users constituency. And she'll be talking to us about how national laws alter the Internet ecosystem. Then we'll have Nigel Hickson, who will be speaking to us how this work is politicized at ITU and the United Nations, because there's a lot going on over there as well. Nigel works with ICANN and has been a long time participant in all of these internet governance things. And then we'll have Matthew Shears and also Robin Wilton, who will be speaking to us about encouraging for good practice in multi-stakeholder participation. And by the way, Matthew and Robin, I haven't got your slides. I don't know if you will just be discussing things or whether you will need to have some slides. When we reach you, then we might need to share screens in a slightly different way. But let's go on first with this. After that, by the way, we'll have a discussion. Hopefully, plenty of time for discussion. This is a 90-minute call. Just two things first. So we'll go through the whole thing, and then afterwards the discussion. We'll open the floor for anyone. If you wish to speak at that point, you'll have to put your hand up. There is the ability in Zoom to put your hand up. In the meantime, please remain muted, because otherwise you get background noises and so on. Second thing, this call is recorded. It's recorded. You can see Jolie is making a recording. I'm making a recording, and we'll be making this call available then afterwards for download in the archives, in the Internet Society archives. So if you're not happy to have this call recorded, then please disconnect now. And I hope that, well, I've checked with our panelists, and none of our panelists have said that they wanted the call to not be recorded. So that's where we are today. Okay. I heard someone say something. All right, so everyone's ready for this. Oh yeah, probably just a few people that joined in and that are not muted, but that's fine. So let's get going then, and let's start first going through the history of the Internet and Internet governance. And as I said, Shiva had prepared some of these slides a while ago, actually, and I just picked and mixed and added a few more. It's quite pleasant. It uses a thing called Prezi, so it's going to be moving around a little bit. I didn't think that this was going to be cut on the side, but the story all started in 1957. Yes, 1957, the launch of Sputnik. Sputnik, this wonderful satellite that was a telecommunications satellite launched by the USSR. And in response to this, if you recall, the whole battle of space. In response, the United States responded with a creation of the Advanced Research Projects Agency, an agency that was going to be able to come up with all sorts of really fancy stuff. ARPA did a number of things, but it funded also a lot of basic research. And the first thing, basic research that was funded was, or some of the early ones, was packet switching. In 1961, Leonard Kleinrock, who was with the MIT, published a paper on packet switching of data. And oh, there's a little typo here, but anyway. And he basically wrote this, and that made a real, well, that kind of changed the way that the telecommunication world looked at things, because it really, packet switching is the basis for transmission of any digital data these days, whilst before there were other technologies that were not based on packet switching. Then in 1962, inspired by this whole thing of a packet switching, JCR Licklider proposed a thing called a galactic network of computers that could talk to one another. And so the idea that you could get computers to connect and get going was pretty early on thought about. And that was the sort of technology that they had at the time, not quite the sort of laptops that we have these days. Paul Baran was in charge then in the RAND Corporation, and sorry if the D is cut off on your screen, because the obviously that's well, my screen has got these things there. I don't know actually how to put these away. Maybe I can put these away.
You should be able to minimize it, Olivier.
Minimize this. Aha! Here we go. Done it. Thank you, Jolie. So Paul Baran from the RAND Corporation came up with various different network topologies and was in charge of a whole group that started working on these things. And so you had the whole idea of a centralized network and then a decentralized network with various different smaller stars that would connect with another star. And then you had this whole idea of a distributed network where everything was connected with nodes around it. And in fact, the C option here, the distributed network, is what eventually the internet became many years later. But of course, at the beginning, you needed to have a network working group that came together in 1968, and that was headed by Steve Crocker and loosely organized to develop host-level protocols for communication over this ARPA net. And you can see how young they all look at the time and how they've changed over the years. There's quite a few stars in that picture. I'm not going to point them out. But in '69, the first RFC, request for comment, was published. And that was quite a big thing as well. Before that, it was just a set of loose papers. And Steve Crocker thought, well, wait a minute, we need to do something to put this all in perspective and just make it like, well, if you have a request for comments, so you've got an idea, you put it in a request for comments, you get other people to comment on it, and then you'll get your feedback. And from that, people will know loosely what kind of standards one could have for running this network. Of course, now you've got thousands and thousands of RFCs that have been created, and those thousands of RFCs, requests for comments, are pretty much the internet standards. But it's important to know that they're voluntary standards. If you don't want to follow these standards, it's up to you. It's not quite sure whether you'll get a lot of people to be able to interact with your software. In '69, they ended up with the first connection, and look at that. It was, I can get some feedback here. And look at that, it was just a note in a notepad. It says, yes, we talked to the SRI, Stanford Research Institute, host to host, which meant that effectively two machines got to talk to each other. And one was the University of California, Santa Barbara. And then, of course, you got more computers that started getting connected to this. And the next thing you know, 4 nodes were on the net. That was very early days. And that's actually one of the original diagrams. So we ended up with this network, as we just mentioned, called the ARPANET. And something that came up a little bit later in the magazine when the internet started growing, and there was some talk about the ARPANET, was this picture of Vint Cerf on the right and Steve Crocker at the back and John Postel on the left hand side with these seemingly strange looking contraptions. In fact, Vint has commented a number of times that the way the network was implemented there, it didn't work. Because, like, as you can see, of course, Steve was listening to John and also listening to Vint, but obviously, obviously they hadn't worked this one out. But later on, they did. And so in 1973, they came up, Vint Cerf with Bobcom came up with the protocol for packet network interconnection, which was the basis for TCP/IP, Transmission Control Program. Transmission Control Protocol, Internet Protocol, and this is pretty much what we now had. And you can see well-known names slowly appearing. That's again one of the original diagrams that were around at the time. Now, internet, well, maybe not in '73, sorry, because I know that Novell and PCs and Macintosh were not around, but this is one of the network diagrams for the 80s, late 80s. Initial internet concepts. So the ARPANET itself grew into the internet, but the internet was based on the idea that there would be multiple independent networks rather than having something that was centralized or controlled by a single host or a single location. And that was the whole pioneering thing, is that it was effectively a network of networks that was completely neutral of any kind of technology that it was running on, whether it was copper, whether it was satellite, whether it was fiber, or whatever you wanted, it would just run. And so you ended up with this open architecture networking where you had the choice of whatever technology you wanted to run, you as the end user or the end organization. As long as you followed the RFCs, you would be able to get connected somehow to that meta-level internetworking architecture. That's how you ended up with the open internet architecture, where each individual networks is completely, pretty much separately designed and implemented, and but they all have to be, they can all be designed in accordance with their specific environments, as long as they have that basic set of characteristics they could connect to the internet. So you ended up with interneting. Each network would stand on its own. Communications were on a best effort basis. So if one path wasn't working in one direction, they try in another direction. The network will try and find another way to get through. You have to remember that the ARPANET was originally designed for the Cold War, as I mentioned earlier. So it was a network to make sure that it could survive no matter what happened. And so this rerouting was particularly important. You had black boxes, gateways, routers to connect the networks, this network of networks. And the important thing at the bottom of the page, no global control at the operations level, which brings its advantages and its inconvenience at the same time. So from 1970 to 1990, the network went from being the ARPANET to being the internet. The ARPANET, of course, giving rise to the military network on the one side, which the US military used, and also to more commercial internet, which originally was through the commercial internet exchange, but then went on well, we're not going to go through the details of history of this. If you're interested in the details of history from 70 to 90, maybe we'll be able to add some more, maybe a future webinar on that. It's quite interesting history. So it grew very fast. 69 for hosts, 1977 grew to 111. 84, we had 10 times more, and 1989 was the big 100,000 number, which felt like a large number of computers at the time. And I recall back in those days, some people saying, well, that's probably the maximum you can get on there. Because people really aren't very much interested in all this technology stuff. But then in 1990, Tim Berners-Lee came up with this thing called the World Wide Web. Now, what was that? Well, that was a browser and web service software. So instead of just having some textual data and sort of emails and complicated services, you could actually start using a point-and-click method, using your mouse and your pointer, and use the wonderful idea of hypertext to navigate through documents. And that's obviously that's Tim back in those days with his presentation and his the first browsers that he had put together for CERN. It's funny that it was originally for an internal need to be able to share documents in a more efficient manner. And little did he know that this was going to be such a huge revolution. And so the moment the World Wide Web was invented, this whole easy way of navigating between websites, it was then called websites, I guess, and services, you ended up with a massive network. So as we said, 1990, just over 100,000 people, 100,000 hosts, and then it just went up and up and up in a crazy exponential manner. And trust me, back in 1990, had you told anyone, and in fact, I know that quite a few people told everyone, oh, everybody is going to be connected, there's going to be billions of people on the internet, they would, I mean, you basically laugh at you, and it's quite incredible. In 2017, is it 2.6 billion or maybe more? I don't know. Some people are saying it's 3 billion internet users. I know there's still billions of people out there to be connected, but it's probably more difficult to connect those people than the first initial batch of people that have been around. Whatever it is, though, it's still growing at an unprecedented rate, and you ended up with this big network of networks, which is pretty much everywhere. And the moment you have an asset like this, something that looks as beautiful as that, you immediately get people coming in and saying, hang on, this thing needs to be governed. It needs to be governed. We need to have some organization that runs this and that is in charge. So multi-stakeholder, because the internet had been built with so many different types of people that were involved in building it. And remember, you had first the standards, and those were like a lot of people, but then you had the people putting it together, operators, some small telecom companies, some people who were in some countries and said, I want internet, so we're going to work with a group of people and try and bring it over. And so you ended up with this multi-stakeholder environment where you've got decisions that are taken in consultation with not only governments, but also with businesses, civil society, individual users, in fact, technical community, anybody who has an interest in developing this network and in moving things forward. And that's a big thing. Multi-stakeholder environment again gives rise to this overall internet model. That's a graphic I took from the Internet Society a few years ago, which I thought really showed the extent to which the internet was multi-stakeholder, or the internet governance, the governance of the internet was multi-stakeholder in nature. If you go on this, for example, the standards, you've got the Internet Engineering Task Force, which now are in charge of the RFCs that I spoke about earlier, and the Internet Architecture Board and the Internet Research Task Force. These are all Internet Society affiliated organizations. But you also have other standard bodies, like the World Wide Web Consortium, the organization that basically came out of Tim Berners-Lee invention. The ITU telecom sector, international telecommunication telecom sector, who are also dealing with aspects of hardware, of bandwidth, of spectrum, etc. So there's a lot of that going on, and so the whole idea is if we can have open standards development, then everybody can be can basically move forward and help this. We've got multi-stakeholder policy with governments, government regional organization, multilateral institutions, of course, the Internet Society, its chapters, its individual members, etc. And you've got other policy discussion forums, which are really important, such as the Internet Governance Forum. And I think that we might be speaking a little bit about this a bit later on, but that is a process that started a while ago. We're talking about the early 2000s, but has gone on for years and has really provided a great way to move the internet forward and to keep the internet as a vector for innovation. You've got multi-stakeholder naming. Well, here you've got, of course, ICANN, the organization that coordinates the domain names, the regional internet registries that distribute these internet protocol addresses, all these numbers, IP addresses, and so on. IANA, the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, they are the ones assigned names authority, one or the other. IANA, let's call it IANA, and shame on me because I've been working on the IANA transition for 2 years, but there you go, things getting old. So IANA that deals with the running of the all the top level domains. And so the database of top-level domains, you've got the generic top-level domains, you know, .com, .net, .org, and you got the country code top-level domains, like for India, .in, for the United Kingdom, .uk, etc. And so all of that is pretty much run in a multi-stakeholder manner. And that's really important. And so that's why I thought I'd give you the whole thing. And the rest of the model also shows you how you've got shared global services, and you've got the variety of end users for the internet. So that's what the sort of word cloud that you get on this stuff. And I think that it gives you sort of a good idea as an example, as a starting point of how we came to be, today with the internet as such, how the internet came to be. So that's a quick rundown. I'm quite pleased I went quite fast on this. And so the next thing that we will have, if we go on this, is to go into the next part of our agenda. And the next person is, let me just quickly download her slide, is Tatiana Tropina, who is going to speak to us about how national laws alter the internet ecosystem. And Tatiana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Olivier. I don't actually know if I really need that slide, because basically I think it consists just of a couple of words, you know, of the keywords. So maybe I can just proceed without it. So the subject I'm supposed to talk on is how national laws alter the internet ecosystem. But I would like to make a disclaimer that it's not only laws, because it's not only about legislation per se, because internet ecosystems can be and is basically altered also by regulations, which are not laws, by policy and policy making processes, and even by, you know, introducing some of the concepts. And one of the main concepts which is and have been altering the internet ecosystem is national sovereignty and internet. And I would like to come back to what Olivier said during his presentation, that if those guys who were at the inception of the internet knew how many people would be connected, they would have laughed at this. I also think that since the concept, even when I connected to the internet for the first time, which was, I think I was 15 years old, it was 1994, something like this, internet, by the guys who introduced me to internet at school and later at the university computer room, they all told me, you know, they were a bit of techie geeks, nerds, and they told that this is the freedom, this is the future. You're going to be a lawyer, but you know, this will have no laws, this will have no regulation. It exists just technically, and it's a freedom. So if those people who were in this at the inception of the internet knew how internet would be politicized, regulated, legislated, I don't know if they would have laughed, but they would have definitely cried, I think. So how exactly the internet is legislated, regulated, and how does it alter the internet ecosystem? Well, as I said, first of all, this concept of national sovereignty and the internet, and it's strictly connected to the fact that so many people are online now, that so many services, including critical infrastructure, including governmental services, and including also information exchange between people, including dissidents, political dissidents in the oppressed regime, including, well, let's say criminals, and so on, everyone, for both legal and illegal purposes. How many information exchange is happening on the internet? Governments who didn't control this, because it was all, you know, privately governed, it was all how to say, was born on the private level and remained private. Governments basically realized that they're too late to take this train. they can maybe only jump on the last wagon and try to stay there. And this concept of the national sovereignty and the internet has been discussed since 1990s, actually, by some of the governments, but it was only recently when it raised again in a very specific way, like introduction of different national security measures, introduction of the concept of the sovereignty itself, for example, by Russia and China, where they say that it is all about critical information infrastructure and protecting their own country information independence. It is now being followed also by, for example, I'm not afraid to say Europe, where people are saying that it's not only technical attacks or technical threats to the internet that are actually threatening national security, but also dissemination of information and misinformation, which they call information warfare, and now connect to technical threats as well, and thinking about hybrid threats. So all these vulnerabilities, thousands of vulnerabilities on the internet, from vulnerabilities to the users created by criminals, to technical vulnerabilities to everyone's computer systems, to the vulnerability of the state itself, political regimes, and also critical information infrastructure, creates this push to, maybe, I'm not talking about fragmentation, but I'm talking that there is a discussion by some governments who say that internet should have national segments, and these national segments should have some, gateways which just make the different national systems interconnected, but national segments of the internet shall be governed, legislated, and regulated by a sovereign state. So this is just an introduction, because I don't know if this sovereignty concept will work. Apparently, it might work for some parts of the world or for some particular countries. We don't know. But right now, how the particular laws in particular areas are changing how internet works, how internet becomes less anonymous, less free, or less safe even. So first of all, security and crime. Governments are responsible for protecting their citizens. Some governments are, under this concept, also say that they are responsible for security of the citizens and they want to control them. So it's not only about security of their own networks or of their own system. It's not only about crime investigations, because apparently when everything and everyone got connected to the internet, there would be crime. Like just in real world, when you go outside, on the street, there would be crime. But the problem is that in the physical world, police knows where the crime happened, where the perpetrator had been, at least he was at the crime scene. And the criminal investigations are always connected to the national territories. So in this sense, governments and law enforcement agencies have nothing, like no other way but to come up with laws. And these laws will change internet, because in some countries they will provide less anonymity. In some countries they will hamper human rights, for example, where criminal investigation techniques get approved without, for example, court approval. So in a way it gets, kind of patchwork of different approaches of how user or someone who is affected by crime would, be dealing with his or her own privacy, including actually criminals. And of course, the national critical information infrastructure protection. It is interesting because in the beginning of the internet, there was a general idea that it was a technical community and businesses who will take care of the information security, still preserving the free flow of information and borderless internet. Now, when so many things are dependent on this infrastructure and on the security of the systems, that governments in many countries and regions, including Europe, are shifting the concept. They're saying, no, now we have to regulate. Now we have, for example, to create the frameworks for mandatory reporting about security breaches. Now we have to, instead of, public-private collaboration, we have to force these guys to share information with us or share threats with us or collaborate with us. and this also changes, the initial idea that internet would be secured and would be governed only by the technical community and industry, and also by the market forces. Olivia, I hope I still have 3 minutes because I will briefly go through the rest. Of course, connected to security and crime, content and services, blocking, filtering, and censorship. Well, I don't have to say much about this, because we all know that not content is available, not the same content is available in many countries due to copyright issues, due to political issues, due to some historical coincidences, like, for example, and maybe valid coincidences and reasons. Like, for example, in Germany, you cannot put online information about Holocaust. So this also is regulated by governments. There are certain laws on this, and be it for good or mostly for bad, like censoring content, like censoring services that can be used, by political dissidents. Governments are regulating internet, and they are changing the values, the core principles of the free flow of information. Then there are different privacy standards, because privacy standards are developing not, evenly across the globe. Look at the EU General Data Protection Regulation, and look at the very specific and limited laws in the United States, and look for how many years industry and governments are discussing what actually do with these differences, and how big businesses can actually operate in this environment, or even small businesses in this cross-border environment. Well, and last but not least, the recent trend is, of course, in the last 3 years, when there have been so many discussions about different governments spying on foreign citizens, is that data localizations. So some laws which governments introduce, or some regulations which are aimed to make data being stored only on the territory of a particular state. Again, sometimes the reasons are very legitimate. Like, for example, as far as I remember, in Austria, no one can store medical records outside of the country. Or some countries say that no one can store financial records because, for example, their financial system or their GDP is based on financial system, and they don't want information to go outside the borders. But many of those proposals and many of those laws are, of course, more or less about surveillance, because this makes much easier for governments to snoop on their citizens. And these laws are apparently also changing the internet ecosystem, and making the flow of information less free, and making the privacy and anonymity of some people much less vulnerable. Well, that's all from me. And I want to say one more thing, a disclaimer. I will be waiting, or I will be leaving for another thing 15 minutes earlier before this webinar ends. And so if you have any questions, please ask them before I leave, or just shoot me an email later. You can find my data. I mean, if you just Google my name or ask Olivia for my email. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tatiana, and thanks for this good, quick presentation on the topic. So the next thing now is the next person now, and I have to look at the sharing the right agenda again. The next thing is how this work is politicized at ITU and at the United Nations. As Tatiana has alluded to this, governments are taking more interest in the internet. For this, we have Nigel Hickson, who is based a lot of the time in Geneva, and spends a lot of time with his colleagues at the International Telecommunication Union and in the various UN processes. Nigel, you have the floor.
Yes, and good afternoon, and I hope you can hear me okay. I never know quite on these link-ups.
Works very well.
Well, at the moment, you can see my picture, which might be slightly disconcerting. So I'm going to actually go off picture, because I find it easier to read notes and that when I'm off picture. But I thought I'd just give you the privilege at the beginning. Anyway, so I'm off picture now. So Thank you very much for the for the opportunity to say a few words, and I think to a large extent, Tatiana, well, in your introduction, Olivier, and also Tatiana's remarks in the last few minutes have indicated why this issue has become so political. Because of course it wasn't in the early days, and as the internet grew up, a number of us were involved in some of the early policy work regarding the internet. Nothing to do with the clever stuff that was obviously done by the people that Olivier talked about, including of course Steve Crocker and Vint and others. But while they were doing this work, or after they'd done this work on the internet, we as policymakers, I was in the UK, a number of other people were in other jurisdictions, began asking questions within government about what will this all mean? Will it be important or not? And I must say, and some of you might have heard me speak on this before, in the early days, the answer was we're not really interested. I mean, the internet was seen only 20 years ago as not being, that relevant really to anything deeply political. It was something that was clearly interesting. It was something that already the newspapers, if they talked about it at all, were talking about it as a resource for pornography and other horrible things online, if you like. And apart from its growth in the academic and the scientific and cultural sort of scientific and technical areas, the internet wasn't regarded as particularly important by politicians. Now, of course, all that has changed, and Olivier has, I think, adequately charted the history of that. So let me, for my sort of brief remarks, really sort of go from the World Summit on the Information Society in 2003 and 2005. I think that's a fairly good place to start, if you like, for our reference of the politicization of the internet. And ICANN, of course, already then was born in 1997. ICANN was a bit of an innovation. I suppose it still is to an extent. I've only worked for ICANN since 2012, so I certainly have no deep history in this. But it is an incredibly interesting body on many counts. I mean, nobody is perfect. ICANN is not perfect in any sense of the word, but it contributes in a very interesting way into this ecosystem. And I think it's true today, as Tatiana sort of hinted at, really, in her presentation, that if we had a blank sheet today on the governance of the internet, not that we would because these things evolve, then there wouldn't be an ICANN. I mean, I think that's abundantly clear. I mean, I think the international community, if they met today to set up some form of internet governance arrangements, would set up something very different indeed. But we are where we are, and ICANN was set up in 1997. The World Summit on the Information Society looked at a number of issues in 2003 and 2005. This was an innovation, the World Summit, by the ITU primarily. It was hosted by the United Nations. And the original sort of impetus behind the World Summit on the Information Society was the digital divide, was the evidence already back in 2002, 2001, that in terms of internet access, there were going to be those countries that were going to find it much easier than other countries. And the World Summit was supposed to address some of these points, and it did. It came up with the Geneva Action Plan, which of course still is discussed today. And only in 2 weeks' time, we'll have the WSIS Forum here in Geneva, which for a number of years now has looked at the WSIS action lines, has looked at what came out of the World Summit on the Information Society, and assessed what has been good and what has been bad, so to speak, from that point of view. But going on to what came out of the WSIS process, because in addition to the WSIS action lines, there was the Tunis agenda, and the Tunis agenda was developed between 2003 and 2005. There were these two summits. There was a working group on internet governance which developed the Tunis agenda, and this agenda sort of tried to address to a large extent how the governance of the internet should be taken forward. It recognized the work that was already being done in the private sector. It wasn't starting from a blank sheet of paper. It looked at what the private sector had done, especially in the scientific and business areas. It looked at what ICANN was doing. It looked at the developments, and it said what should happen in terms of taking this agenda forward. And essentially, there were two concrete actions out of this. One was to set up the Internet Governance Forum. And as Olivier said, this has been exceptionally important, and hopefully there'll be a bit about that later on. And secondly, it said there should be a process of enhanced cooperation so that governments can carry out their legitimate role in the development of public policies to do with the internet. And this second one, which I'll concentrate on, is, I think, the most interesting in terms of this politicization of the internet. Because here was, in one hand, the leaders at the World Summit saying that there should be a multi-stakeholder environment in which to discuss internet governance, the Internet Governance Forum, and at the same time saying that that the UN ought to look at establishing some form of enhanced cooperation process so that governments could rightly fulfill their responsibilities on internet public policy. And paragraph 69 of the Tunis agenda, I think, sums that up quite well. And that debate has been going on since 2005, and that debate still goes on. In the United Nations, in the United Nations General Assembly in 2015, the WSIS, if you like, in December 2015, the WSIS process was renewed in the sense that there was a resolution that recognized the importance of this WSIS process. It recognized the importance of the IGF and established the IGF with a mandate of another 10 years. But also said that there should be a new working group falling under ISOC to look at this whole notion of enhanced cooperation. There had been a previous working group which hadn't really produced too much of substance, and so a new working group was set up in 2016, and that is ongoing. And this working group is supposed to bring forward recommendations on how enhanced cooperation should be taken forward. And that working group is, as I say, taking place. And those recommendations have to be made to the CSTD, which is the Commission on Science and Technology for Development, early next year. And within that working group, there are different opinions. Some bodies like ourselves, in ICANN, in ISOC, in other bodies in other countries, it's a multi-stakeholder working group. And many of us believe that, by and large, this multi-stakeholder approach to the governance of the internet and the involvement of all actors in other aspects of governance of the internet, on the internet, whether it be to do with data privacy, whether it to do with cybersecurity, whether it to do with child online protection or intellectual property, benefits from the participation of all actors. That's why some of us are in this game. That's why some of us work as we do, because we truly believe that things are better when you have a diversity of actors working with them. Whereas many governments, for legitimate political, social, cultural reasons, believe that primarily it should be the role of governments to determine policy in these areas. And to an extent, governments do determine policy in a number of areas, whether it's to do with data protection at the EU, as has been referred to, whether it's to do with intellectual property at the World Intellectual Property Organization, or whether it's to do with e-commerce at the World Trade Organization. But this working group on enhanced cooperation has to decide to an extent what should take place in the future in terms of the governance of the internet. So it's some interesting discussions taking place. I won't go on much longer because I know there's other people that want to speak and we ought to have a debate on this. But just to mention the ITU in this context, I mean, the ITU is a participant in the working group on enhanced cooperation. The ITU does work on internet governance. They have a public policy working, sorry, they have an internet policy working group on internet governance that meets, that has open consultations. These open consultations are multi-stakeholder. People get involved in them. The ITU sponsors the WSIS Forum, which I've mentioned, which is a multi-stakeholder vehicle as well. But the ITU also is responsible for the so-called International Telecommunication Regulation, which is a regulation governing international telecommunications. And this was the subject of a conference back in 2012, the so-called WICIT conference, which updated the international telecommunication regulation. It had last been updated in 1981, and so 2012 was the next iteration of it. But that conference became politicized, not because of the ITU, but because of members legitimately of the ITU decided that this would be an opportunity to try and look at the governance of the internet to an extent. And that debate still goes on, whether the ITU should have a wider role in terms of internet governance. Should the ITU, as some member states have suggested and might suggest again at the plenipotentiary in 2018, have a role in terms of internet addressing, in terms of distributing internet addressing, or a role in terms of sanctioning top-level domains. So these are still debates that go on. I think I'll stop there, but I think this is an incredibly interesting time to be having such a discussion, because clearly the if you like, the movements in society are probably stronger. The currents, the undercurrents are probably stronger than we've seen them in a good number of years. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this intervention, Nigel Hickson. And without any further ado, we can move on to Matthew Shears and Robin Wilson. We've spoken a lot about multi-stakeholder participation, multi-stakeholder systems, and Matthew and Robin will be taking us through encouragement for good practice in multi-stakeholder participation. Matthew Shears.
Thanks, Olivier. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, very well. Perfect.
Wonderful. So we've already touched on the multi-stakeholder model and in a number of different ways already in what's been said so far. So I'm not going to belabor the notion of multi-stakeholderism too much. But I would like to talk a little bit about examples of how multi-stakeholder process has worked, and talk a little bit about the different types of multi-stakeholder engagement, and then offer up some challenges for food for thought, and then turn it over to Robin. So I think there are a couple of things that are really important when talking about multi-stakeholderism from the outset. And I'll just go through these relatively quickly. I think first and foremost, it's important to recognize that multi-stakeholder processes are not something that's unique to the internet space. They actually, in many ways, predate the internet as we know it today. Some engagement has been seen back at the Earth Summit with a significant presence of civil society throughout that process. The UN was talking about multi-stakeholderism back in 2000. There are UN-based and organized multi-stakeholder partnerships, and there are plenty of examples of multi-stakeholder entities, parts of industry as well. So we sometimes think that we're operating in some kind of unique multi-stakeholder space, but it's actually not true. And there's great value to looking at those other multi-stakeholder spaces because we can learn a lot from them. The other thing that's important is that we're seeing, and Nigel touched on this a little bit, but we're seeing an evolution in how we talk about stakeholders, which of course is critical to the whole notion of multi-stakeholderism. And as Nigel mentioned, that back in the WSIS Tunis agenda, we had relatively static approach to what the roles and responsibilities of stakeholders are, or I should say were back then, because I think it's fair to say today that we have a very different notion of what those various stakeholders can do and how they engage, in particular in the internet policy space. It's back then it was, for example, it was stated in the Tunis agenda that the role of civil society is to talk to and engage with the community, as in society. I think it's very fair to sit today to say that even those stakeholder groupings are outlined at that time in the Tunis agenda now have become, they're merging, they're blurring. It's less easy to say whether an individual is from civil society or the technical community, and indeed, I think many of us are in many ways hybrids, having worked in different parts of the sector. And so that's evolving. I think that causes some consternation among governments, because governments like things that are static and understandable. But it's a reflection also of how the internet is evolving, and all of our individual and organizational roles are morphing at the same time. The other thing that we have to be really careful about is when we talk about multi-stakeholder, what exactly are we talking about? What's the role of that? So I tend to kind of break down the multi-stakeholder discussion into two pieces, and it's a kind of a spectrum. I tend to talk about multi-stakeholder policy discussion on one end and multi-stakeholder policy making on the other. And if you imagine that that's a trajectory of sorts, obviously a multi-stakeholder policy discussion forum would be the Internet Governance Forum. On the other end, you've got this multi-stakeholder policy making, and I think, and I'll come back to this later, that the IANA transition is a very good example of a multi-stakeholder process that actually did have significant policy implications. And then somewhere in the middle, you have this, what I would I guess you could say is an example would be the Net Mundial, where it was a multi-stakeholder process. It didn't actually decide policy, but it made a series of recommendations in multi-stakeholder fashion. That's largely true until about the last hour, when some items were taken off the Net Mundial statement because of the interventions of governments, but the process itself was very much a multi-stakeholder process. So I tend to it's important when we're talking about multi-stakeholder policy discussion versus multi-stakeholder policy making, that we're very clear what we're talking about, and I'll come back to this in the last part in the challenges. And then finally, in terms of these broad issues, there is no one model. I remember a moment during the WSIS process that Nigel referred to, where we were having a debate on how stakeholders should engage in particular issue areas going forward. And talking to a Middle Eastern government, and they said, well, multi-stakeholder, where's the role for government in that? So we have to be very careful about how we talk about multi-stakeholder, and we have to be very careful how we talk about whether or not there is a particular model, and I would argue there certainly isn't one. The multi-stakeholder model will, I think, vary and have differences based upon the issues that are under discussion, the jurisdiction that it's working in, and I think we have to be very flexible in terms of how we look at multi-stakeholderism more generally. So let me stop there and then talk about good practice and engagement, because I think that's part of what Olivier really wanted me to look into. I'm going to talk about two things, one of which is the IANA transition, which I think many of you will be very familiar with. And then I'm also going to talk about something that Tatiana and myself have been involved in over the past 2 years, which is the Freedom Online Coalition Working Group 1 on cybersecurity and human rights. And these are kind of two examples of, well, IANA certainly is an example of the policymaking end of that spectrum I was talking about earlier on. but the FOC, the Freedom Online Coalition work that Tatiana and I have been involved in, sits somewhere around the Net Mundial. It made recommendations, wasn't policy making, but it was a multi-stakeholder process, and there's some interesting learnings from that. But let me touch first briefly on the IANA transition. So, as you know, the IANA transition did two things and actually brought about a third. First of all, it shifted the stewardship of the domain name system from the United States government to the multi-stakeholder internet community and largely to the ICANN community. That was a significant achievement in and of itself. But at the same time, that was the IANA transition piece. At the same time, we had this parallel effort to increase the accountability of ICANN so that it was capable of looking after the domain name system without the United States government being the backstop. And it was this second piece that was so important in terms of talking about multi-stakeholder processes, because what this process did in strengthening ICANN's accountability is it changed very much the power dynamic in ICANN, empowering the ICANN community, the multi-stakeholder community, and changing the governance structure of this somewhat unique entity that ICANN is. And at the end of the day, both of those two things, enabling the US government to step away and empowering the community, in many ways are, I would argue, certainly the best example we have of multi-stakeholder processes delivering the goods, so to speak. So the transition itself allowed the US government to step away, which I think everyone's familiar with. But what it also did is it changed the dynamic internally in ICANN. ICANN now is really a significantly different model than it was before. The multi-stakeholder policy development model in ICANN remains the same, but the community's power over the organization itself, the board, and the overall governance has been greatly increased. And this was done through a truly multi-stakeholder process. Some of the powers are, for example, the new powers that the community has is that they can reject ICANN budgets, they can reject different kinds of bylaws, they can remove individual board directors or recall the ICANN board, et cetera, et cetera. So these are very substantive changes to ICANN. Now, some of the learnings from that process, the first one was that it took 2.5 years to bring this to fruition. There is no doubt that a multi-stakeholder process takes longer, requires greater resources, and it certainly, one might have argued that certainly would have been much easier if the US government had said, well, you do this, 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 and this, and this, and it would have taken less time. But that's not what they wanted, and that's not what the community wanted, and that's not what ICANN wanted, and that would not have been very productive for the entire internet community globally. So at the end of this 2.5-year process, we have this significant change. And some of the things that are really important, now getting a bit to the practical dimensions of it, is that for it to succeed, we had to have common objectives. And part of those, some of those objectives were set up by the US government, and some of them were set up on the accountability side by the community, but they were common objectives, and they were bought into by all stakeholders. The other key thing was that we needed very clear operating procedures, and the notion that they have in ICANN of setting up a charter for a multi-stakeholder process or for a working group process is incredibly important and is essential to multi-stakeholder processes being successful. So clear operating procedures and parameters is another incredibly important thing. Another one is the timeline. There were target dates. The community knew it had to work towards a particular date. Now the transition slipped because I don't think anybody had anticipated the totality of work that the community had to undertake. But those deadlines were very important. Stakeholders elected their own leadership. You know, leadership was not imposed from the outside. There was a significant amount of transparency, and there was consensus on the decision-making process. and it was going to be consensus decision making. So these are elements that have made the IANA transition a success. Hopefully some of those learnings that came from that process, and we've talked extensively about the learnings in various IGFs since the transition, and there's quite a bit been written about it. But hopefully those learnings are also transferable and can be used in other spaces and other very possibly in other kinds of policy processes. So let me switch just briefly to the Freedom Online Coalition working group. Now, the Freedom Online Coalition, as you know, is a group of 30 countries that are dedicated to promoting human rights online around the globe. They have been around since 2011. In 2014, some multi-stakeholder working groups were set up in the Freedom Online Coalition. In the working group that I was a co-chair for and Tatiana was a member of was the working group 1, which was on human rights and cybersecurity. The working group was small, 15 people. That's an important learning in and of itself. There were representatives from business, different stakeholders, civil society. There were 3 governments who were involved, 3 Freedom Online Coalition governments. And I would have to say that it took probably about a year for us to develop within that small group the level of trust where we could have open discussions on very sensitive issues like cybersecurity and human rights. I will put into the chat the link for that particular piece of work, so you can go and see what the product of that working group was. But the interesting thing from that, if you're interested in cybersecurity issues, and I'll come to the final piece, that's why that's important, is that it's probably the first attempt to actually look at cybersecurity and human rights, taking it beyond the platitudes that you typically see in speeches and commitments by governments. So it was really trying to put some flesh on the bones. And the final piece, and one which is very pertinent to the chapters, the Indian chapters, is the importance of looking to the GCCS meeting that's going to be held in November in this year, November, in New Delhi. It is a great opportunity for civil society and other actors to engage. The reason why it's important from a multi-stakeholder perspective is that the last GCCS meeting in The Hague was very open to civil society and other actors. It was also at the meeting in The Hague when there was a statement in kind of the final outcome statement that talked about the importance of multi-stakeholder processes and cybersecurity that I think we need to look to and to leverage as stakeholders, and to really encourage governments to live up to their commitments and the things that they've said in public and endorsed, so to speak. And because one of the challenges that we have at the moment is in these sensitive policy areas, we don't see much engagement by governments with other stakeholders. Okay, so that brings me to challenges. Cost, time, investment, multi-stakeholder processes are not easy. They're not quick, but they are incredibly rewarding. There is absolutely no doubt that we would not have had the same kind of outcome from the IANA process if we had had it imposed upon us. And that's a very important reason for why multi-stakeholder processes are important. Other challenges, well, it's about expertise. It's about role of stakeholders. You know, one of the things that multi-stakeholder processes that people say is, well, it's got to be open and inclusive. But quite often we don't find that when it's open and inclusive like that there is necessarily the right expertise. Sometimes it has to be learned on the job. But it's very important to get the right people around the table in a multi-stakeholder process, and that's sometimes a challenge. So why is multi-stakeholder processes going to become more relevant? Because whether we like it or not in our hyper-connected world, we are all part of the network. The society is impacted as never before through a whole range of things that have been touched on earlier on. And so bring that complexity and the necessity for there to be a full recognition of all the players who are impacted by our digital networks and everything else is absolutely essential. with that, I'll stop there and hand over to Robin, and I'll put a couple of links into the chat for your enjoyment, including a document that we've developed at Global Partners Digital, which is a tool for assessing how open and inclusive a particular policy process is. Thanks, Olivier.
Thank you, Matthew. Over to Robin Wilton.
Thank you very much. So a quick sound check, Olivier. Is the audio okay?
Absolutely perfect.
Great, thank you. So I don't have slides either, so this is going to be, you're going to do your own pictures in your head, which is far better than my PowerPoint. My role at the Internet Society is that I'm a staff member in the Internet Technology Office. My focus is on identity and privacy, and as much of the security topic as is needed to support the identity and privacy work. I'm going to approach this question of encouraging good practice from a slightly different angle. I'm hoping that we don't need much encouragement to adopt good practice because it's good practice. But I want to look a little bit at motivation for good practice, and particularly for taking a multi-stakeholder approach to it. And to look at a little bit at the practicalities. And to do that, I want to look at two examples from recent online history. One is the Mirai botnet of late 2016. If you remember, the Mirai botnet used IoT devices to overload the domain name service and therefore some network routing services. And it pretty much took the country of Liberia offline. And the second example I'm going to talk a little bit about is from early 2017, and it was an incident, a hack of a company called Cloud Pets, which had connected toys as the target. So I'm just going to put those two things into the chat window so that you at least have the names of the examples there. So here we go in the chat window. So the Mirai botnet, as I say, this used connected devices as the hosts for malware bots, and it was therefore able to recruit, as the saying goes, a vast number of connected but not very intelligent devices, which in turn generated traffic which swamped a particular DNS server. And the point about those devices is that they were connected, but they don't expose a user interface to all of the things that they do. So for example, if you have a smart light bulb, your user interface to it is usually, can I turn the light bulb on or off? Can I do that on a time setting or remotely? And can I dim it if it's an adjustable lamp? That's your user interface, but it's not all that the light bulb does. It collects other data about your usage patterns and it sends them to someone else. So what happens with botnets like Mirai is that malware exploits that difference between what the device shows to the user, the person who's bought it, and the actual capabilities of that device in terms of network connection, data collection, data sharing with third parties. And the more we see intelligent and connected devices proliferate, the more that kind of attack becomes viable on a large scale. The reason I use that as an example is that if you're the designer of a connected light bulb or a connected toaster, when you go through the design process, you might not spend much time thinking, I wonder if I should secure my device against being turned into part of a botnet that attacks the DNS services of an entire country. That may not be top of your design list when you're thinking about how to make a toaster. And yet, that is one of the risks that is opened up by the connection of smart devices and dumb devices on a massive scale. So if it's not the toaster designer who's responsible for taking the security measures, who can? And here we start to look at the owners and operators of the infrastructure itself, the entities that operate the DNS and routing services which form the infrastructure of that distributed network that Olivier had in his initial presentation, the mesh of connected nodes. So the point we find when we look at that mesh of interconnected nodes is, okay, imagine there are 100 participants in that network, each operating their own DNS node. It may not be realistic to assume that 100% of them are virtuous and well-behaved. Some of them may be badly behaved, others may be incompetent, others may just not be interested in behaving securely. But the point is, we need a majority of those node owners to understand that they have a collective responsibility and that it's not enough only to do your work as an individual node. You have to do things that benefit other nodes in the system and not only yourself. And this is the key to a principle that the Internet Society calls collaborative security. The idea that your role may not simply be to secure your little piece, but to do things that bring benefit to others who also need their pieces to be secure. So we've written several papers and various kinds of material on the theory and practice of collaborative security. And I've put a link to that in the chat window. So that was a little bit about the Mirai botnet, something that may not have affected you directly, but which was an attack that used end-user devices to attack the infrastructure on which you depend. The second example I wanted to talk about was, as I said, cloud pets. This was something that surfaced early this year, and I think it's an example that shows how deep into your home this kind of attack can strike. Cloud pets sounds like a fantastic idea. It's a cuddly toy, and it's connected, and it's slightly intelligent. The idea is that parents and grandparents and aunties and uncles can connect to a server, and they can leave a message for a child. When the child squeezes the hand of their teddy bear, the teddy bear goes to the server and it downloads the message. And so when the child is going to bed, they squeeze the bear, and the bear plays them the nice message, you know, the good night message from dad who's on a business trip, or the good night message from granny. Well, it's fantastic. That sounds wonderful. Problem was that the company didn't seem to take very good care of the data that was confided to it. Now, this wasn't just a case of, well, someone else might hear the message that granny left for the child. It went further than that. One of the sets of data the company had was the account details of everyone who had bought that pet, bought that cuddly toy, registered it, and paid for the cloud service of leaving messages. Those account details were compromised. So this is nothing to do with the teddy bear. This is to do with how you registered your account and possibly your payment details as well. But then the database with the messages in also turned out to be insecurely held. And so it was possible for a third party to access the messages that had been left for children. And that's pretty worrying in itself. But the next step was that the attackers removed the databases from the control of the company that had sold the bears. And then they went to the account holders and said, we've got your data. We have the messages that you left for your children. We're holding them to ransom. Pay us money and you can have access to the data. So here we have an attack that exploits the weakness in one party's behavior to hold to ransom another party who couldn't protect that data themselves. So what I think this shows is the threats that online and connected devices pose can be large scale. They can be very intrusive and intimate. In this case, perhaps threatening the safety of a child. And the use to which attackers put that data is varied and can be very creative. So in this case, holding the data to ransom and inviting parents who may have lost messages they considered precious to pay to get that data back. So the attackers can be very creative here. And again, like in the Mirai botnet example, it may not have been in the mind of the designer of that cuddly toy some of the bad uses to which that data could be put. But the solution doesn't lie in the hands only of the consumer. Other people have to do their part correctly in order for the consumer to be protected. And again, we think that a collaborative approach to securing that kind of service is the only viable way forward. Now, I can't point you to a similar collaborative security page for that privacy-related example, but my own work last year and this year focuses particularly on what I call ethical data handling. If you lead a modern connected life, you have no option but to hand your data over to a multitude of third parties. It's just not realistic either to consider that you as a consumer and a citizen don't do that, or that you do it but you can still somehow secure the data. You can't in many instances. You rely on the behavior of others to protect your data and keep it secure. So my aspect of the collaborative approach here and the multi-stakeholder approach is to encourage data controllers to go beyond the legal requirements of the protection of personal data. I want to raise the bar and encourage those data controllers to act ethically and not only legally. So I'm looking for trailblazers in this area who are prepared to help us define a set of ethical standards that a data controller can advertise, that they can be audited against, and which give consumers reassurance that that data controller is doing their part to help collaborative security and collaborative privacy become a reality. And I think that's probably enough from me. Olivier, thank you very much for the opportunity to address this community.
Thank you very much, Robin. And wow, what a trip on today's webinar, starting with the origins of the ARPANET and moving all the way to a current issue where you're issuing a call for help and for a participation in a multi-stakeholder way. The floor is open for questions and comments. And I know that Shiva Subramanian Muthusamy has been waiting. And Shiva, you've got comments. So please, you have the floor.
Olivier, thank you. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear you. A little bit faintly, but it's fine. Go ahead.
These are challenging times or interesting times, as Nigel observed. The undercurrents are strong and the underlying reasons for security measures are also strong. I mean, we have grave and defiant security threats, and the measures taken today appear to be valid and needed, warranted or unwarranted, fair or unfair. But I'm in general talking about the general trend on security, making security center stage. And this happens to be the moment when it becomes important for us to notice that security has moved center stage. It has become the epicenter of governance. It is on the internet and in the real world. I think this is the time when we also have to think that our lives are being altered by the very security measures that seem necessary. The way we operate the internet is altered, the internet is altered, our own lives are altered. And my only question is that, is it important for the internet community to wear a hat across the table? Whenever some security measures are proposed, it's usually proposed in multilateral forums, or security measures are proposed at national government level without consultation. So is it important for us to assert that we need to have a role, a kind of supportive role, not a hostile role, but a role wherein we'll ask questions whether these measures are necessary, whether there could be alternate measures by which the security threats could be handled without altering our lives. That's my point.
Thank you. Thank you, Shiva. It's Olivier speaking. Robin Wilton, perhaps you might have a comment on this?
Oh, goodness. Let me think about it.
Okay. All right. We've got a hand up. First, I'm going to read a couple of questions which were in the chat from Jose de la Cruz from ISOC Puerto Rico. And welcome, Jose, for this. I know there's been a lot of coming back and forth in the chat on this. There was a question for Matthew Shears. What would be a good mix ratio? Many experts are not very good at governance. And then there was another question for you, Robin Wilton, not Milton, but it comes out the W and M. Do you have a working group on the ethics issue that you have mentioned?
I do, and if you'll pardon me, that one's easier to answer than Shiva's question. Yes, I have a working group. It's at the moment it's a loose coalition managed by email, and folks are welcome to help us with that work. Current members include Data Ethics EU, which is a small consultancy in Copenhagen. Some members of the ADAPT Centre at Trinity College in Dublin, and a couple of others, mostly focused already on ethical data handling. We started out with that group just looking for examples of practical guidance. How do I design ethical data handling into my product or service, and how do I turn that into practice? Over the last 6 months, I've kind of shifted my focus here. We found some good examples of good practice, but we also realized that you have to give data controllers a realistic and compelling way to build that into the value proposition they offer their users. And the example we came up with eventually, after quite a lot of thought, was if you think of free trade products. You go to the supermarket, you look at the products, some of them have that little free trade logo on and others don't. You don't expect all of the products in the supermarket to have it on, but if you see it, you know what it stands for. And so you can make an instant choice. Okay, I want this bar of chocolate rather than that bar of chocolate. And you know why you're making that decision. You know what kind of commitments the producer has signed up to in order to produce that product. So my current thinking is maybe we need something like that demonstrates that a data controller has signed up to a set of principles for ethical data handling. But the consumer can see that represented in a very clear indication at the point where they make their choice. So that's the current thinking. As I say, if folks are interested in joining that discussion, that would be very welcome.
Thank you very much, Robin. If you could just drop your email address in the chat, if anybody wishes to get in touch with you to follow up, that would be great. Dr. Nara Simhan, you put your hand up, so you have the floor. Let me just, there we go. I've unmuted you, so please proceed with your comment and question.
Yes, actually, I have a question. Is it audible?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, thank you. Nowadays, the people are talking about the IP version 6, and many articles pertaining to the IPv6, they are mentioning that it can provide better security solution. Can any one of your experts please share some views on that to get rid of this doubt? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure who wishes to answer this. Robin, IPv6. I mean, we're huge trying to push IPv6 in the internet society. Is that really a good security solution?
Well, let me give a disclaimer. I'm not so much a networking guy. I think the more pressing reasons for IPv6 are less to do with security and more to do with how many addresses we have. And given, as I said, the proliferation of smart and connected things, we do need the massive increase in address space that IPv6 offers. from an individual point of view, if I look at my home router, I can go on there and it gives me the option of enabling IPv6 or not. But it doesn't give me very much guidance about what the security reasons might be for doing that. So I don't think security would be my primary motivation. So I think actually I would look at it from a different perspective, that in terms of both security and privacy, as my home starts to contain more and more IPv6 addressable devices, what is it in my home between me and the network that gives me control and agency over how those devices connect and who they talk to? So I'm, among other things, involved with a very interesting project run by the University of Cambridge called the Data Box, which the plan is that that's something that would sit between me and my home router, and it would allow me exactly that, a visibility and control point over the multitude of devices that might be in my home and might be connecting to the network. So, I mean, as Jose says in the chat window, I'm not sure that IPv6 necessarily directly addresses the security aspect of network connection, but I think it certainly raises security issues that need to be addressed.
Thanks for this, Robin. And in fact, there's also a point from Jose de la Cruz. IPv6, in my opinion, does not contribute to security. It's a funny animal, actually, IPv6. Over the years, I've heard some people say actually it weakens security because they're looking at the idea of having network address translation as a firewall, as a way to secure a network, and so on. And then, of course, IPv6 would not have this network address translation, but then it could as well. And of course, you could have a firewall that could perform probably even better types of security on this. I think perhaps we might have a topic for a webinar, a future webinar on this, with the security of IPv6 and also the privacy aspect of IPv6, as Robin has pointed to. So we probably need a lot more time to discuss this one, and we'll invite people who are experts in it. And I know in the Internet Society we have plenty of experts on this on IPv6. So thanks for asking the question. Any other questions or comments? I'm trying to read through the chat, and I'm seeing Matthew. Did we? You didn't answer the question on what would be a good mix ratio when you mentioned, you know, the sort of mix of experts and the different parts of a multi-stakeholder system.
Yeah, thanks, Olivier. It is a great question. I think the challenge for us, and I alluded to it a little bit, the challenge for us is we don't have the luxury really anymore of being siloed in our capabilities and expertise. So many of these issues now require that we be somewhat technically aware and somewhat governance aware when we're addressing issues, certainly when we're addressing issues like national security or cybersecurity and things like that. I don't know that there is an ideal mix. It's a great question. I think it depends on the issue. The more technical the issue, the more that it will require the kind of technical expertise, the more policy, the more governance the issue, I suspect it will swing the other way. That's not so much the challenge, I suspect, but rather the ability to find that balance among the people and that one has access to who are involved in the policy process in question. Thanks.
Yeah, Nigel, if I could just add very briefly to that. I mean, totally agree with Matthew, and I think, you know, where some processes go wrong in that they put on to a group of policymakers an issue which has you know, fairly detailed technical requirements to it. I mean, at the moment we have a government group of experts delineating on the future of cybersecurity in terms of the more security focused, the national security focused areas of it. And into that conversation are issues like DNSSEC, are issues like IPv6, etc., etc. and there are no independent stakeholders in the room, and surely that's not right. Thank you.
Thanks for jumping in, Nigel Hickson, with ICANN. We are reaching the end of this webinar. 90 minutes have passed already, but I have one last question. And taking us back to our title, the title of this this presentation today, which is effectively Core Internet Values, Changes Happening on the Way the Internet Works. Things are obviously changing. They're changing in all sorts of ways, both technically and politically, and with governments having an increased interest in what's going on, and with a whole multiplication of fora out there. I guess that we can't just go against any changes, and you know, the core values are there somehow to be kept. But what should we watch out for specifically in the changes that are happening, and what should we really push for specifically, bearing in mind some of the core values might be amended, might have to change, and you know, the network today, as we've said, is not the same network as it was in the 1970s and the 1980s, and no doubt in the 1990s. But you know, what do we have to watch out for specifically? What are the things we have to avoid, the errors we might avoid making? And unfortunately, Tatiana has left the call, as she mentioned earlier. So we'll go in the order, the speaking order. We'll get to Nigel Hickson.
Let me answer.
Okay.
Actually, now people.
Dr. Narayanan, yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Now people all over the world, they are talking about internet neutrality and all. But apart from every neutrality phase, we need to have some wisdom-based handling of internet resources. Not only that, we need to handle it in a very diplomatic way. Even though some cybersecurity attacks persuade to us, we need to have some efficient solution, both from government expertise, from the enterprise, and also from the individuals. So that is my point of view.
Okay, thanks very much for this. That's very good. Let's go to Nigel Hickson.
Olivia, hello, Nigel. Sorry, Olivia, it's Nigel here. Sorry, yeah. I was just, I've got to run to another call, so I do apologise. But I'm sure Matthew and Robin will be able to answer that point. But okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to take part.
Thanks for joining us, Nigel. Let's go over to Matthew Shears, please.
Hi, Olivier. Well, I put it in the chat. I think that, you know, at the end of the day, some things must remain. And even though the technologies will evolve, there are non-technological issues and characteristics and principles that must remain. And ISOC did some work a long time ago about the ability to connect, the ability to speak, the ability to innovate, the ability to share. When we think about the various technologies and how things are going to evolve in the future, we need to think about those things. You know, how much control will we have over our own data? Will we be able to share information in in 5 to 10 years as we do now or have done in the past? I think that this notion of user choice is essential as well. But these things, in my mind, are kind of, you know, they're timeless as opposed to technologies which may well evolve. Thanks.
Thanks for sharing these thoughts, Matthew. And Robin Wilton?
Yes, I think the word choice that Matthew used is a very important one here. I would broaden it slightly and say this is not just about choice, it's about what I call agency. What is it in the system that is giving effect to what I want, to my preferences and my intentions? So I further agree that those abilities, the ability to connect, to share, to speak, to innovate, and so on, those remain true whatever the technical methods are. But at the moment, what we have is a technical infrastructure that allows people to do that. But everything that we do online across that technical infrastructure is mediated. So, for example, if I speak to Olivier on VoIP, or if I talk to my daughter on Facebook, it may feel as though that's a one-to-one communication, but it's not. It's passing through a third party, and that third party has interests that are not the same as those of the people communicating. So I think it's vital for us as the users to retain agency, that even when we are in a one-to-one context like that, we're aware that everything is passing through one or more third parties, and we have some degree of control and consent over what is done as a result of that. So as I say, I see it as a matter of agency. What is it in
Oh, have we lost Robin?
Sorry about that. It dropped, but I was finished.
You were just your last sentence. I think you might have to repeat your last sentence.
Just that it's about agency. What is it in the system that is acting on my behalf and representing my interests and intentions?
That's great. Thanks very much, Robin. And for the last words, Shiva, did you want to say just a couple of words, and then we'll have to close?
I think it all went well, Olivier, and the meeting was about tracing the history of the internet and understanding internet, and examining the present challenges, and taking a look at what is being altered. And the panelists broadly covered the various aspects, and the important takeaway is that we need to pay closer attention to the internet as a multi-stakeholder forum, and not make any decisions unilaterally. And I hope you can add your observations and conclude this meeting with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shiva. Well, is there much else to add to all of what's been said here? I certainly think we need to work more on this. We'll have other webinars that will touch on this issue and on similar issues, as we mentioned, for example, IPv6. There's certainly a lot of work that is taking place and that needs to take place in a multi-stakeholder manner. And we need to make sure that the user remains at the center of all of this. The internet, as we knew from the very start, was user-centric. It still needs to remain user-centric, and we have to be careful of all the excesses that could be brought on by any specific type of stakeholder, either as a quick kickback scenario based on whatever threat it is that is out there, or based on any specific commercial incentives. And with this, I'd like to thank our panelists again for having spent the time to explain their points. It's been very exciting indeed. I want to thank Jolie McPhee in advance, because he's going to take what we've got here and he's going to make a video out of it that will be archived, and we will make sure that this is shared with the community. Yes, Robin, you better be scared here. And thanks, of course, to everyone who's participated in this call. I hope that it's been helpful for you. And as I said, we'll repeat that very soon indeed. So with this, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, everyone. Bye-bye.